As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I begin, as always, by asking you to silence your electronic devices if you haven't already done so. I see some people reaching, which is why you got to do it every time. As you've all seen, we have a diverse and really packed schedule this fall. We've already gone through a number of programs since we started back after Labor Day. This week, we have another one. We will welcome on Thursday representatives of Sakasawa Peace Foundation, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and the East-West Center in Washington for a discussion about reevaluating the benefits and the importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship. Next up after that, on November 14th, we're presenting a special Young Friends of the World Affairs Council program sponsored by the Pamela and A.J. Raju Foundation. The event titled Young Friends Giving, Philadelphia's Entrepreneurship, Food, and Culture from Around the World. And the folks in attendance there will have the opportunity to meet 3 of Philadelphia's most exciting up-and-coming young chefs and discuss their international influences and Philadelphia's burgeoning restaurant scene with truly global cuisine. Also that week, November 17th, we will present the 3rd and final part of our election 2016 series, because mercifully the election will be over on November 17th. That program is titled What Just Happened? Post-election, post-partisan presidential punditry. And it will really be an interesting program. I hope you can attend, featuring political consultants Chris Matola and Andy Johnson, who one Republican, one Democrat, who are very thoughtful people, even though they practice in the trenches of politics. And I think they're going to have some real insights that you won't have heard about what just happened. And moderated by David Eisenhower, presidential historian and the host of the World Affairs Council's public television series, The Whole Truth. Now on to this evening's program. It was not so many years ago when many professional students of global affairs argued that the world had entered an age in which the chances of war among major nations, certainly nuclear-armed nations, had fallen close to 0. Our national security concerns were to be defined going forward, it was argued, by subnational threats like ISIS and transnational issues like climate change. But anybody able to turn their gaze away from the mud wrestling of the present campaign knows, by the rest of the news that's out there, that old-fashioned nation against nation power politics, with the real risk of hostility, has come roaring back. And the next president will surely face, from day one, very difficult decisions about if, how, where, and when to respond to potential threats, potential provocations, including Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. In other words, the academic analysis to be discussed tonight by Professor Horowitz could hardly be more timely or important in helping illuminate what lies ahead for our country beyond this election. Michael Horowitz is an associate professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania and an associate director of Penn's Perry World House. He's the author of the book Why Leaders Fight, you see a copy there, and previously authored the award-winning book The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics. Professor Horowitz will compare the leadership traits of the 2016 presidential candidates based on the Leader Experience Attribute Descriptions, LEAD, dataset, which he and his colleagues have put together, which contains data on more than 30 different attributes of world leaders, from military service to education to marriage and children, for more than 2,500 world leaders in office from the late 19th century to the present. So this is indeed an important political science exercise, and one that couldn't be more timely. So please join me in welcoming Professor Horowitz.
Thanks. And am I the only one who thinks that this campaign has just gone on forever? mean, seriously, like, I love politics. I mean, like, I teach U.S. foreign policy at Penn. I mean, like, I live and breathe politics. I mean, it's like when I wake up in the morning, it's something I'm, like, super excited to think about. And dear God, I just want it to be over. Today, I want to talk about leadership, which I think is one of the most important but least well understood topics in politics today. And I want to talk to you essentially about the presidential candidates, about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and a couple of the others, in the context of some research that my colleagues and I have been doing on the background experiences of world leaders and how those experiences shape the way that leaders behave when they get into office, and specifically their military behavior. I want to start with the question of, does it matter who we vote for? And, as a side note, please vote. No matter who you vote for, like, civic duty, et cetera, et cetera. But voting is important, but we tend to think that who we vote for actually, should make a difference. And it's because the world is made by people and the decisions that people make. And so the question becomes, how do we evaluate people? And how do we make decisions about whether we trust people, whether we think they have good judgment, and whether we think they will, defend the country or perhaps go even a bit too far. In an election season, the question is, what can we learn from the life experiences of our candidates to help us make better assessments of the way that they're likely to behave when they get into office? And we see this all the time in presidential campaigns. I mean, this is just from the primary. Remember, Hillary Clinton is a college activist. I realize that now this isn't showing up there, so. Hillary Clinton is a college activist. Ted Cruz is a parliamentary debater in college. Ben Carson, when he just seemed like a really, really smart person before he did whatever happened to him in the campaign. And, seriously, Ben Carson gave an unbelievable graduation speech at my brother's college graduation in Rensselaer in 2003, where he talked about his medical career and, his experiences. I was super impressed. I went and bought one of his books. I was like, wow, this guy is super smart. He is super smart. He's just super smart at being a doctor. And then Donald Trump, obviously, and we'll talk about Clinton and Trump a bit. While the idea that life experiences shape the way that we view the world and thus how we should evaluate candidates might seem like common sense in a way, it's actually kind of controversial in the world that I normally live in over in West Philly at the University of Pennsylvania. And you can imagine kind of two different ways of thinking about the role of leaders. In the first, symbolized by this guy, Thomas Carlyle, is probably sort of the way that I learned about the importance of leadership in high school, and I was thinking about, obviously this is gendered, but thinking about the history of the world is the history of important decisions made by important people. That was the way we used to think about global politics, that people thought of world history as a story about elites. But over the last 100 years, academics have tended to follow the advice of someone who, ironically, was a leader who profoundly affected world history, and that's the guy on the right, Bismarck, the German chancellor who famously led Germany into the wars of unification that set the table for, a generation later, the First World War. He argued that, in fact, leaders play a very little role in shaping the way that countries behave. That instead of leaders, it's the security environment. It's how strong your country is, how big is your military, how strong your economy is, what do domestic political interest groups look like. That the role of leaders themselves, according to Bismarck, is fairly limited. And academic research for the last generation has tended to side with Bismarck over Carlyle, arguing that, in fact, we don't really need to know much about leaders themselves as long as we know stuff about countries. But if you're following the presidential election today, then you might suspect that if the United States elects Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, we might get maybe some different policy outcomes, a different United States. We understand that intuitively, but we never really had a way to measure that and demonstrate that systematically using the tools of social science until now. And to understand that, we need to understand where leader worldviews come from. Well, how do we view the world? And you can think about the worldview of leaders starting with the view of nature and sort of immutable characteristics. You can add to those immutable characteristics your family in childhood. Did you grow up in a stable home, for example? Did you have siblings? You can add to that the role of education. How much education did you get? What kind of education did you get? Did you go to a boarding school? Add to that a very prominent early life experience, military service, along with other occupational experiences that happen in late adolescence and early adulthood. These things profoundly shape us because they start teaching us what the sort of strategies that we're good at and bad at. They affect what we call efficacy beliefs. If you do something, say you stay up all night studying for a test. For those of you in the back of the room that look like you maybe still or could be taking exams, you stay up all night, and look, I don't take any exams. I give exams. I don't take exams. You stay up all night studying for an exam, and you get an A on that exam. You know what that makes you more likely to do? Do the same thing next time because you proved it worked. Whereas if you, whether rightly or wrongly, whereas if you stay up all night, then you're exhausted and you fail the exam, next time maybe you study a little bit in advance. Essentially, the experiences we have and how well they go then shapes how we view the world in our risk propensity later on. And so then you can add to those early adult experiences your adult family characteristics. Are you married? Do you have children? Which affects your shadow of the future, essentially. Whether you think about just affecting the world now or you try to say make the world a safer place for your children. So that's where we think that leader views come from. And we use that insight to build the lead data set, or the leader experience attribute descriptions data set. As Craig Hubley pointed out, the lead data set is made up of about 30 different characteristics of heads of state. So we basically, using a grant from the National Science Foundation, took a database of 2,500 leaders from around the world, from 1869 to 2004, every head of state from every country. We then sort of, imagine like an enormous Excel spreadsheet. We then built out 30 different background characteristics, from whether they served in the military to whether they were in combat, if they grew up in a broken home, their educational experience, their job before entering politics, birth order. Turns out birth order not as important for at least what we care about as people tend to think. Birth order is like a zombie theory of politics. Like no matter how much evidence like stacks up against it mattering, like everybody's just like, oh wow, but like I'm a younger sibling. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, I do the same thing, but I'm totally not a younger sibling. So we build the lead data set, and so we have data now on 30 different background characteristics of 2,500 leaders. So what do we do with that data? The traditional way that you model international conflict, if you're a political science scholar, is you look at how the military power of a country, its domestic political institutions, who it allies with versus who it traditionally has had conflicts with, and you use that to try to build a statistical model to help you understand which countries are likely to fight at different times. What we did is tossed all those things out and just added leader attributes to see how accurately we could model international conflict just looking at the background characteristics of the leader. And it turned out that we could actually do very well. And what I want to do is tell you about some of the key insights from why leaders fight and then use that to talk about the implications for this election. So the first is that our model actually does pretty well at explaining the most dangerous leaders in international politics. This is all going to be a setup. When I tell you things about Hillary and Trump later, you should believe me. But what our statistical model suggests, for example, that Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin are both more dangerous than 90% of the world leaders in our data set. And which we think makes sense, because both of them are risky, more likely to start conflicts, not say like Hitler risky, not like 1 percentile, but risky. And also, it's so much fun just trying to find pictures of Putin to put up. Like if you're gonna like Putin with wolves, Putin with bears, like Putin with his shirt off, like whatever. There's all sorts of like Putin stuff. Anyway, I like Putin with wolves. So the second insight is that leaders matter everywhere, but they matter the most in autocratic regimes. And this makes sense, right? Because in autocratic countries where the executive is not constrained by the Congress or the courts, especially say like a personalistic dictatorship like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the ability of a dictator to influence the foreign policy of a country is way higher than the ability of, say, most American presidents to influence U.S. foreign policy. So, for example, if you are, say you're a Republican, and you want to vote for a Republican for president because because of Supreme Court appointments, but you're really worried that like, hey, this Donald Trump seems like a dangerous character. Well, you would look at a chart like this and be like, don't worry, because the effect of leaders in democracies is pretty small. The thing to look at, though, is that this difference here, which you can't really see on the end, is actually still a significant difference, suggesting that who we vote for actually makes a difference. It's just that in more autocratic countries, it matters way more whether you say like Saddam is running your country or not. All right, third insight comes about looking at the leader attributes that matter. Which particular experiences that leaders have make a difference. The first is the single most significant predictor of conflictual behavior when a leader enters office are those leaders that have prior military service but not combat experience. Essentially, they have all the positive socialization associated with the use of force, and you feel like they understand the military as a tool and how to use it, but none of the downsides of, say, like facing the risk of death, seeing your friends die, etc. So that combination, I mean, look who's in this category. We have Kaiser Wilhelm II, we have Mobutu, we have Saddam Hussein, we have Gaddafi, and we also have a couple American presidents in this category. One that I will use to illustrate that when you have a statistical model where you're generating estimates for 2,500 leaders, you are going to get some things wrong. Guy in the upper left-hand corner, Jimmy Carter. Not who we think of as like the most aggressive American president ever. So like obviously, the model's not going to get everything right. And in fact, anybody who comes here and tells you, hey, I have a statistical model to understand the world and it gets everything right is probably lying to you. In the bottom right-hand corner, though, we have George W. Bush, who served in the National Guard but did not seek combat and led the United States into wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And if you look at the transcripts, if you look at the Air Force One pilot on 9/11, actually gave a great interview with CNN about 10 years ago where he talked about how he felt like Bush's military training affected his response, and that Bush was self-consciously drawing on his military experience in the training he got in the Guard in thinking about how the United States should respond to 9/11. Here's an application of that concept. Think about Assad in Syria. So who are we talking about here? His father rules Syria. He's educated, more or less in the West. He was a young guy essentially when the conflict. That's his age when the conflict started, and had military service, but not combat experience. And so if you put his characteristics into our model, what do you expect? You expect basically what we've seen, which is somebody with a way above average propensity to do dangerous stuff in their neighborhood, which is exactly who Assad is. Last thing, gender. Does it make a difference whether you have a female head of state or not? If you look at this, this is what a statistical plot called a box plot that shows essentially that dot in the middle is an average, and then the 75% confidence intervals, the 95% confidence intervals, and then those outliers on the top. What you see here is that there's actually no statistical difference between the way that men and women behave in office. There are no female psychopath leaders either. If you like those the top 10 most sort of dangerous leaders, like your Hitlers, your Stalins, whatever. But statistically, there's actually no difference. But keep in mind, caveat here, there haven't been that many female heads of state. Something I hope changes over the next generation. So this is an example of something where this is correct based on our data today. With the very limited sample of female leaders that we have, it's hard to know for sure, but it does seem like there's no significant difference between male and female leaders. And I'm going to use that then as a jumping off point to talk about the US presidential election. After all, who do we have? We have Hillary Clinton and we have Donald Trump. And so what we can do is take the lead model from Why Leaders Fight, plug in the characteristics of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and then use that to make predictions about their likelihood of starting international conflicts. And I think the results are interesting, maybe not what you expect, but then I'll hopefully persuade you that they're right. Then I guess we'll see later on. All right, Hillary Clinton. So who are we talking about here? 68 years old, no military service. She's been married once and has one child, Chelsea. And what about her prior experience that might be relevant? Because the other thing we want to build into the lead, we built into the lead model, was what kind of relevant life experiences to being head of state? Say like foreign policy experience, prior government experience, etc. In this case, we're talking about somebody who's been a senator, who's been a first lady, who's been the Secretary of State, and who's been involved in public service for most of her life. But particularly the characteristics that matter for us here are being a senator and being the Secretary of State. And actually, she is the first sort of serious candidate in a way, since the person I'm about to tell you about, to have both that congressional experience and executive experience in quite a while, and that the person that our model suggests that she is the closest to, in the way that her foreign policy would look, is actually George H.W. Bush. Hillary Clinton's, our model predicts she's would be exactly average for an American president in terms of her propensity to use military force abroad. And which fits with the way that the way that Hillary, the way Secretary Clinton speaks in the campaign, a lot of what we know about her foreign policy ideas. All right, what about the demo? Sort of like with Putin, they got a little bromance going on, but sort of like with Putin, it can be hard to, you're like scrolling through Google Images trying to find like what pictures you want to use of Donald Trump, and you're trying to like choose correctly, and just like find something that's like trying to find something that's just like where he's like reserved and like calm and whatever, like whether you like him or not, like the guy gets excited. And so what are we talking about here? A little older, still no military service, married 3 times, and has 5 children. What are his prior experiences? Literally nothing. So, in that he has no prior sort of government experience, he's a business person. And to be fair, that's his selling point. His argument for being president. The point here is not to crack on Trump, although it's easy to make, whatever, just like watch SNL for the last month. He doesn't have, prior government experience, the sort that our model would, so essentially, what I'm leading up to is the fact that Donald Trump has essentially none of the background experiences that our model would suggest make you especially dangerous. And Donald Trump actually ends up in our model comparing most closely to this guy. Who can name who this is? Boom. Wow, you guys are smart. So, way better than my undergraduates. Calvin Coolidge, in that Donald Trump would fall into the 20th percentile of American presidents when it comes to his propensity to start international conflicts. Now, that might seem surprising, given how he behaves some of the time, but here's another way to think about it. One of the things that Donald Trump has been most consistent about in his campaign is his lack of faith in American alliances and in America's traditional global role. Since World War II, the United States has basically had the same global role. The United States has been the backstop of global security. That causes the United States to get involved, like it or not, in a variety of conflicts around the world that are lower than, say, like World War II level, style conflicts. Donald Trump has essentially said he wants little to do with that. He's okay with China having a sphere of influence. He's okay with Russia having a sphere of influence. He's concerned that American allies and partners don't, pay their fair share. If you look at the data, it's actually be more expensive, for example, to bring those American troops home than to base them in places like Japan. But put that aside, his foreign policy philosophy is actually quite isolationist. Which means that while Donald Trump may be erratic, and if you're liberal, you may view him as a threat to American democratic institutions, from an international perspective, what Donald Trump is essentially promising is a foreign policy where America abdicates global leadership. That's a foreign policy where America is less likely to get engaged with the world, thus explaining why he would be in the 20th percentile. Alternatively, our model does not measure anything on the order of psychological characteristics. The reason is that we're focused exclusively on objective life experiences, because we think that generally you see the influence of psychological factors through the life experiences that you have. Sort of the proof is in the pudding. And that works on average for most leaders. But just like our predictions on Jimmy Carter essentially are inaccurate, it's possible that the model is wrong about Trump as well. But I do think that when you look at his foreign policy philosophy, there are reasons to think, again, like it or not, that what he could be promising, essentially, is a much less active American foreign policy than what we've seen in the past. And with that, I will stop, and I look forward to the questions and conversation.
So you had 30 factors in terms of the backgrounds of leaders. What are the sort of top three that indicate a predisposition to engage in conflict?
So the top, I already told you about one, and those are those leaders that have prior military experience but not combat experience. And you know, as I said before, it's because they have the positive socialization associated with the use of military force, but not the not the sort of hedging characteristics that you get from being from seeing, experiencing the sort of risk of death. The second is being a rebel, and rebelling against the government on your territory, and then ending up in power eventually. And being a rebel, we think, is sort of risky. Remember I told you about efficacy beliefs before? When you do something and it works, then it makes you more likely to do it. Rebelling against the government's super dangerous. I mean, most rebellions against nearly all governments fail. And when you're part of a rebellion and it fails, your risk of dying is really high. So if you participate in a rebellion and you survive or even thrive, what is it reinforcing? It's reinforcing essentially that you are good at taking risky gambits, which I think why it's not surprising that former rebels are systematically a little more aggressive. The third, and this will surprise nobody who is familiar with literature in psychology, is growing up essentially in a sort of losing your parents and growing up having a essentially extremely unstable childhood. That we know from research in psychology, when you look at childhood development, that growing up in an extremely risk factors for sort of future crime, lots of things, flow from being in really unstable situations growing up. And so it's not surprising then that leaders that have those experiences, those prior experiences, may also be a little more, can be a little more aggressive and conflict prone. And again, with all of these, life experiences are not destiny. And in some ways, knowing about these things could make you more likely to hedge against them. And then I'll also add one more caveat there, which is when we talk about sort of taking risk here, what we're talking about is starting military conflicts. Because one thinks about that as an inherently risky endeavor for a country. There are times where fighting wars is a good thing, or being probably maybe not like yay good thing, but a necessary endeavor for a country. So there might be times when one wants a more aggressive leader in office because that's somebody you're in a dangerous neighborhood and you want someone who will work to protect the interests of your country.
So you talked about prior military experience without combat experience, right? So, but for a long time, the United States had president after president who had seen combat in World War II, Republicans and Democrats. And I think you used the phrase sort of normal American president, right? And for a long time, I think that might have been part of what defined a normal American president, whether you're talking about Eisenhower or Kennedy, vastly different in different ways, all the way up to George H.W. Bush. They all had in common combat experience. It's probably going to be very rare going forward that we're going to have even candidates, much less presidents elected, because of the share of our population that has seen combat in the last generation. So does your model suggest, and this may be sort of an odd way to put it, but does your model suggest that the lack of a pipeline of people who have had combat experience makes foreign adventurism more likely going forward?
For a country like the United States, what our model suggests is that leaders with prior combat experience actually behave more like leaders that have never been in the military at all. And one way to think about that is the power of democratic institutions. So if you're in an autocratic country, you generally get into power through a coup, through a rebellion, something like that. So it's those kind of gamblers that end up in office. In the United States, that's not the case. And the way to think about it from an American perspective is we select Eisenhower from the generals after World War II. We don't select MacArthur, and we don't select Curtis LeMay. And which I think is telling, and is a story in some ways about American democratic institutions. I actually wouldn't be surprised if you see a growing number of candidates, though, for a high-ish office with combat experience. In that, if you look at just in Missouri this year, for example, I'll pick on Missouri because whatever, it's the thing that came into my mind for the first time. Both the Democratic Senate candidate and the Republican governor candidate are both people that served and fought in Afghanistan. And so I think there's now a generation of combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan in particular who are, who started in, maybe local sorts of politics and are now starting to run for statewide office. And so it wouldn't surprise me, given that the military is one of the most popular trusted institutions in the United States, that if any of that sort of cohort proved to be reasonably effective politicians, it wouldn't be surprising at all to see some of them running for president someday.
I want to talk a little bit about ideology, which doesn't feature much in this analysis, and the relationship between pre-office ideology versus handling events as they occur in office. So George W. Bush, we all remember, campaigned against, quote, nation building, while President Obama campaigned on an end to the war on terror, not just to withdraw from Iraq, but an end to the concept of the war on terror. At least substantially, both of them reversed those positions in office. They governed, the opposite of what they had campaigned on. So, what does your study tell us about the relevance of platforms, the stated ideologies of the candidates?
I think I would say two. That's a great question. I would say two things. The first is that what I think our model tells you is the tendencies that people will have when they face those kinds of crisis situations. For example, our model suggests that faced with the exact same situation, a George W. Bush would be about 30% more likely to use military force than a Barack Obama. Of course, both of them use military force, and that's because if I gave like a much longer, less funny or interesting, or at least I think funny, academic talk, then I would have showed you a slide that basically displayed how we think about leader attributes as working with essentially those sort of more traditional factors that people think about, like how powerful a country is and its domestic political institutions. Because sometimes essentially, we would say the system does the work. If you're, say, a leader, we have a map in the book that shows over different periods of time the sort of what different neighborhoods in the world look like. So if you look at, there's a map in there that shows Europe in 1938. And Europe in 1938, and of course, because this is the way you generally do things, like the more red the country is, the more dangerous it is. And like Europe in 1938 is basically all red. And so even for those leaders that say we're less risky, that might be in some of the countries that are not red. I mean, whatever, they're getting dragged in. There's nothing that they can do about it. So sometimes the neighborhood sort of determines what happens. I would say the second thing is that I think it's interesting that the consistency with which our presidential candidates of both parties tend to campaign on, both reversing, of course, the mistakes of whoever came before, regardless of what party they were, but also trying to the sort of bring America home theme. We've seen essentially since the Cold War, in one way or another. Yet it's sort of like the Godfather Part 2. If any of you have seen that, the more we keep trying to get out, the more the world keeps dragging us back in. With the Middle East, I think is as good example of that as any. In that fundamentally, what I think it shows actually is that Democrat or Republican, there's remarkable consistency in American foreign policy. And what this election, at least to me, has revealed is that the debates we have in American foreign policy, for those of you that are football fans, basically occur between the 40s. And it's taken a candidate like Donald Trump, or in some ways in Bernie Sanders in the primary, to reveal how small in some ways the debates we often have in my world are, and thus how much we agree.
So your model says what common sense also says, that the current leader of Russia and North Korea are dangerous folks. Does the current global neighborhood in which the United States lives require that we elect somebody who can face those threats from a position of strength.
I mean, from my perspective, I mean, if you come over to West Philly and come sit in my U.S. foreign policy class, you will learn that I can be like a little bit hawkish about the world, and so from that perspective, as someone who has not been opposed to, say, American grand strategy since World War II, I think strong American leadership is vital on the global stage for preserving stability. I mean, the theory of United States foreign policy since World War II has essentially been that there are lots of small-scale threats abroad, and by engaging with those threats abroad, it makes it less likely that they will grow to the size of a sort of World War II level challenge. People can argue about whether that's right, that's right or wrong, but absolutely. I mean, I think that what Putin's invasion of Crimea in particular, that was the first military invasion for the purpose of conquest, essentially since Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in fall 1990. And unlike that, it was not met with immediate international reversal. In fact, Russia has now incorporated Crimea into its country, and that to me suggests that that international conflict is still on the table in a way that we wish it wasn't, but which will require American leadership.
Last question, then we'll turn to the audience. Your study starts with folks in the 1860s, goes up to the present. How much do nuclear weapons matter? Do you see a change of behavior after 1945 in terms of how these factors play into the overall risk of conflict?
So you can think about nuclear weapons in some ways, and in the effect of nuclear weapons on war in say a symmetric context, like a context like the United States versus the Soviet Union in the Cold War, where both sides have nuclear weapons for most of the Cold War, is something that decreases the overall risk of conflict but increases the consequences. And so what you see among symmetric relationships between nuclear states is sort of a dampening of the effects of, it goes back to leaders are really important, but there are other things that leaders face, and the risk of nuclear escalation being something that has often induced caution. Say, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev and Kennedy both, decide like, hey, maybe today shouldn't be the day, maybe we should back down. I think you do see some of that, which then dampens some of the effects that you might otherwise see. Our model, interestingly, if you look at why leaders fight, actually assesses Kennedy as an extremely sort of conflict-prone, risk-prone leader. We don't see what a Kennedy, obviously because he's tragically assassinated. We don't see what would have turned out. But if you look at the sort of tapes and some of the instincts at the outset of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you think about things like the Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy was more than willing to use military force, even in cases like the Bay of Pigs, where it seemed like a dice roll at best, even going in.
Please.
I have one concern with your model.
I have many concerns.
If I give you a pure psychiatric view of Trump, his bulliness, his inability to read, he has a staying power of nothing. He has no sense of the world at all. He has a father that created problems for him. On the same token, you take Hillary. She came from an educational background. She came from a thoughtful kind of experience. But she too has psychological problems where she wants to be damn strong. She wants to prove that she's not just a weak lady, but she in fact understands foreign policy and knows what. None of that shows in your model, because the psychiatric view of these people concern me much more than anything else that we could deal with in terms of how they're going to perform, what kind of decisions they're going to make, based on their family, based on how they've been treated. That scares the living daylights out of me in one case.
I think I can guess which case. So I would say a couple of things about that. I think it's a great point. I can tell you essentially the academic reason why we didn't incorporate some of those things, and then I can explain to you why I think we can still say something about some of those things. So the academic reason is that if you think about the reason why leadership has been so hard to study in the social sciences has been a data problem in some ways. How do we get beyond the, I'm going to read Woodrow Wilson's speeches and do sort of psychohistory on Woodrow Wilson and then sort of make a judgment. And a lot of that stuff was really valuable sort of at the time, but it limited our ability to make systematic insights. And so what we wanted to see with this as sort of a first cut is how far could we get just looking at behavior we could observe. And our theory was also that some of the sort of psychological characteristics that you're talking about. Now the problem is that with somebody like Trump, the error factor in our model is higher. That with many leaders, especially people that are running for office in the United States, they both have a variety of background experiences and varied career experiences that help us that we expect that some of those psychological characteristics filter through. So you see some of that in action. We don't really with Trump because he's basically only done one thing for his whole career. It has nothing to do essentially with the government, which is why in our model the error values essentially for Trump are higher. They are because the uncertainty surrounding Trump is higher. And then I'll just say on Hillary Clinton that one possibility, the results I showed you suggest that men and male and female leaders behave, they're statistically indistinguishable. One possibility is that what you have are, it's possible that, there are many possibilities. One is that female leaders are actually just as risk-prone as male leaders. One possibility is that maybe most women are less risk-prone, but the women who get selected into higher office are those that, tend to be sort of just as risk-prone as men. Another is that there is, sort of the overcompensation kind of argument that you that you made. I think Hillary Clinton's, personally, I think she's consistently been pretty hawkish, or certainly since the second term of the Clinton administration. But I think the challenge is that I'll be honest and say we don't have the data for that. There just haven't been enough female heads of state. But to help us tell which of those explanations might be true, my bet is that I will modestly say I don't really know what the general distribution of the population looks like, but that I'm not surprised to see male and female leaders with similar risk rates, because I think it reflects also the process by which institutions select leaders into office.
Please.
Can you begin to model leaders and their propensity to conduct a cyber war?
Can you repeat the question so everybody can hear?
So he asked about a sort of next generation kind of conflict, the propensity to conduct cyber war. From our perspective, that would be the same. We wouldn't view it. We would think about cyber war as from the perspective of a traditional model of international conflict. Cyber war is considered a sort of lower level military dispute. Now that might be wrong, because we need to update our models to better understand the consequences of cyber, essentially, which is, I think psychologically, because we can't see it, it makes it hard for many people to get their minds around. But our model would, if our model says you're in the 90th percentile, that includes sort of cyber conflicts as well as other things. So from our perspective, it explains in some ways, some of Russia's aggression in the cyber realm over the last few years.
I'm curious about what your model would say about our leadership leading up to World War II, where we prolonged it and took a catastrophic event to get us into the war.
So, far be it from me to say anything bad about some of America's great, whatever, people that are like way probably smarter and did amazing things that I obviously haven't done. But Franklin Roosevelt actually shows up as an extremely low risk leader in our model. He's about in the, I'm trying to remember, I think somewhere between the 35th and 40th percentile from the perspective, looking at the range of American presidents from the beginning of our data set to the present. So consistent essentially with the question that you asked. I think the Why Leaders Fight model suggests that Franklin Roosevelt was not gunning for a fight, essentially.
On the same theme, so both before World War I and World War II, we really wanted to stay out of it, but yet that caused us more likely to get in it at a later period rather than stepping up earlier. Somebody who wants to be isolationist was really going to be more eventually war prone.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why, for my personal, stepping back from the book itself a little bit to the way that I think about American foreign policy. This is why I think isolationism is dangerous. I think that what we've learned over the last 100 plus since say 1898, say the Spanish-American War, when America really becomes a global player. Since that point, whenever America has sort of put its head in the sand about global challenges, what we've found is that those challenges have gotten larger. And that in fact, those who tried to keep us out of conflicts and to disengage from the world, think about say like Hoover's reaction at the beginning of the Great Depression, have in fact made things worse, which is not, to be clear, a defense of everything that America does in the world. Like we do plenty of stuff that's wrong, but it is nearly always been worse when we've pretended like those bad things weren't happening. So I think you're absolutely right on that front.
Please.
So your model of, let's say, Hillary Clinton says that based upon certain attributes, she might act a certain way, but don't we also have enough history of her to also say we can predict kind of like what she's going to do? Like we know there's been statements when she would have been in Syria. We know what she did in Libya, with the leading with the European nations. So don't we have enough experience with her at this point to say, kind of have an idea, although, like what you said with Bush, things could change because circumstances could change. So what do you use to judge?
So from our perspective, it's a good reason to buy the book. In seriousness, that I think what we've seen out of Hillary and her foreign policy views, especially as Secretary of State, is pretty consistent with what our model suggests. And so, from that perspective, the fact that you can say we're a little more confident in her because we've seen all the stuff that she's done, that's good from my perspective because I think it's pretty consistent with what our model suggests, which means that our model might not be totally wrong, and that's the way we can judge essentially these things. And I think it definitely is true that if you imagine different models of how the United States selects leaders, with different leaders we just have different degrees of confidence about the way that they'll behave. And I would say that those degrees of confidence basically come from two sources. The first source is what they say, and what they say that they're going to what they say that they're going to do, and the second is what they've done. And those are not always necessarily the same thing. And we see politicians all the time change their positions, et cetera, et cetera. More generally on domestic politics than foreign policy, but I think that Hillary's an example of somebody who's been around on the national scene for so long. In some ways, we have more information about Hillary Clinton than I think we've almost ever had about a presidential candidate ever. I mean, think about George H.W. Bush. He's actually probably like the most qualified president in American history. If you think about the sheer number of different jobs, from a foreign policy perspective, the sheer number of jobs in the national security world that he had prior to becoming president, and George H.W. But it's not like excluding when he was vice president, it's not like he was massively in the public eye for most of, a lot of that was sort of occurring, right, like stage right, essentially. So I think Hillary's unique in how much we know about her, which is sort of interesting from a societal perspective, I think, as well.
Mitch.
Yeah, how do you, great interesting factors. The factor of like great presidents, great leaders trying to determine who will bring it around them. Like President Reagan, or President Kennedy, or President Nixon with Kissinger, they end up bringing some great people around them, and would argue that affected their leadership. How would these factors, can you determine who you think might bring the better advisors?
Did everybody hear the question? Okay, I'm getting a lot of nods in the back.
So that's a great question, and actually from an academic research perspective, that's actually one of the places we want to go next, is trying to understand decisions that not just about who becomes the leader, but who they surround themselves with, because that seems to undoubtedly affect the sort of decisions that they make. But although again, I mean so Hillary versus Trump is interesting in this respect. I think that the community in American politics that's been the most unified during this election has actually been the foreign policy community, and that the sort of die-hard they hate being called this, but die-hard neoconservatives from the George W. Bush era, for example, and people that would generally consider themselves pretty progressive foreign policy sort of analysts are all everybody's sort of unified in opposing Donald Trump. I mean, they say politics makes for strange bedfellows, and never more than in this election, particularly in the foreign policy arena. And I'd point to people like people that served in the George W. Bush administration, like say Elliot Cohen or Tom Christensen. People that served as kind of the assistant secretary, sort of senior advisor kind of level. To say nothing of like what Condoleezza Rice might be thinking right now. But so with Clinton, I think that there's a fairly predictable set of people that would be her advisors. I mean, Michelle Flournoy is being touted for Secretary of Defense. If she wants it, that seems very likely to happen. There's a set of people that all seem to be interested in being Secretary of State, but who have relatively similar foreign policy preferences. Jake Sullivan, who's running foreign policy for the Clinton campaign, seems like a potential to be national security advisor. These are people that are very well known and whose views are very well known in the foreign policy world. With Trump, I mean maybe Trump would bring in people that with amazing insights that would shape American foreign policy for the better, but the traditional establishment, sort of Republican foreign policy establishment, both of the George H.W. Bush variety and of the George W. Bush variety, neither of those sides are really supporting Donald Trump, and so who he would bring in as his top advisors is actually a lot more unclear than it is for most presidential candidates. And so, again, our uncertainty level is higher.
Please.
Well, the uncertainty level, I mean, one of us spoke about psychological factors. Here we're talking about the people surrounding them. But I think, for me, especially watching Trump, it's what is the power of his convictions and what's his fund of knowledge? It seems so shallow, so superficial, and he makes up things every day. So I mean, how do you factor those things in? And do you have anybody that you could compare to Trump? Someone who has had no political or government experience, comes in from the outside. You can imagine somebody smart, surrounded by interesting people who could be successful. Is there somebody comparable?
I'm going to give an example now, which will immediately seem wrong. But it's a great question. So here's an example that again is not exactly what you're asking for, but close-ish. When George W. Bush took office, there was a lot of concern that out in the world that he lacked a lot of the experience that we would generally like a president to have. And the response essentially of the Bush campaign was, don't worry, we're going to surround him with experienced advisors. So you have Don Rumsfeld, who'd previously been Secretary of Defense. You had a former Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, who's the Vice President. You have Colin Powell, who's probably the best known military leader in the United States, a former military leader in the United States at that time, as the Secretary of State. So the idea there was we're gonna take sort of a team of all-stars. And then what you need most out of the president then is good judgment, is the ability to filter that advice from their advisors, and then make good choices. And then and then we could debate if you want about whether one supported or not or did not support various things during the George W. Bush administration. But I think what's telling about Trump is that his views seem to not change at all, no matter what the information environment looks like. I mean, pretty much in 1982, Trump got upset about Japanese companies potentially driving one of his companies out of business, and his view of trade hasn't changed since. And so on the one hand, you have remarkable consistency in Trump's worldview. If you look at some of the things that when he has said things about foreign policy over the years, there's actually a whole lot of consistency in them, in that no matter what's happening in the world, which suggests that he might not actually be all that excited about listening to advisors. On the other hand, the thing with Trump that seems so, that raises the bar, raises the uncertainty question, is just how reactive he seems to be. When the latest campaign controversy strikes, it's like, who knows what he's gonna say? I don't know, but I wanna tune in and find out. And like, he's counting on that, right? Because if one wants to believe, for example, that Donald Trump is like actually going to be a responsible president, you would essentially argue that he's being crazy like a fox in the way that he's responding to various things, and he actually has, sort of mainstream steady views on sort of many topics. And this is sort of a gambit to generate a lot of media attention because he's been having trouble raising money. And again, we can talk about whether that's true or not, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's another example of why we're a lot less sure about what he's going to be like. Because on the one hand, he's had very consistent viewpoints, which suggest that he may be a little less likely to listen to his advisors. On the other hand, he seems to make sort of decisions very quickly when new things happen, and his instincts appear to always be to re-raise. Like if you were playing poker with Donald Trump, I don't think he folds. He basically just raises. And I don't think there's no reason to expect he would be any different in office, but it's hard to say.
Okay, time for one more. Okay.
I was just wanting to just bring this sort of back to the world, and
Sure.
The chart that you put up on the autocratic governance was really fascinating, and I was wondering what role religion or the lack thereof plays into the propensity of some of the worldwide leaders we have now.
We have not found any evidence that that religious adherence, say like the surface religion that somebody says that they belong to, influences the likelihood that people will be particularly risk prone when they're in office. But religion is something that's especially, you think about the trouble in measuring things about leaders, and the things that are hard to measure, if it's hard to measure stuff about leaders, measuring stuff about the religiosity of leaders is sort of even harder, because imagine that the United States has a president who's a Presbyterian. All right, so the president says that, he or she's a Presbyterian. All right, which of the two major American Presbyterian denominations does that person belong to? And what kind of, do they go to 10th Presbyterian Church here or First Presbyterian Church? Those are both great institutions, but they have both, agree on very core theology things, but there are certainly differences between them. And if you wanted to understand, how the religiosity of a potential president, how the religiosity of a candidate might influence how they would behave in office, you'd actually want to know some pretty detailed stuff about the theology that they believe in, and that data is really hard to get on the macro level. But it's obviously something we're interested in as a country. I mean, think about how much time we spent talking about Obama's church back in the 2008 presidential campaign. But on the world level, at least, there's no evidence systematically that say, if you're a Muslim or if you're a Christian or something, you're sort of more likely to start conflicts.
Thank you. This has been illuminating. Thank all of you. We have the book, and we have the author to sign the book, so if you'd like to stay around and pick one up, that'd be great. Thank you very much.